The Khmer Empire built the biggest city the world had ever seen, bigger than Rome at its height, bigger than Constantinople, bigger than any city in medieval Europe and China combined. At its peak, close to 1 million people lived inside its walls, surrounded by stone temples taller than any cathedral that existed anywhere on Earth. And then one day, almost overnight, the whole thing was just gone. The streets emptied. The palaces fell silent. The temples were left to the jungle, and the trees moved in and started eating the stones. Within a few generations, the greatest civilization in Southeast Asia had been forgotten so completely that when European explorers finally stumbled across the ruins 4 centuries later, the local villagers shrugged and told them giants must have built the place, because no human could possibly have done it. So how does a city of 1 million people just vanish? And how does an empire that controlled most of Southeast Asia for 600 years collapse so totally that even its own descendants forgot it existed? To answer that, we have to go back to a tiny jungle court where one young man made a single decision that would echo for the next 6 centuries. Somewhere around the year 770, a young Khmer prince named Jayavarman was living as a hostage at a foreign court on the island of Java, far across the sea from his homeland. The Khmer people back then weren't an empire. They were a scattered mess of small, swampy kingdoms fighting each other across what's now Cambodia. Java had bullied them for years, demanding tribute, taking their princes as insurance, and making absolutely sure no Khmer leader ever got powerful enough to push back. But Jayavarman was watching. He was watching how Java did things. The court rituals, the god kings, the way one ruler could snap his fingers and command thousands of men. And somewhere in that gilded prison, he started thinking, why couldn't the Khmer have all that too? Around the year 790, Jayavarman finally got to go home. Nobody knows exactly how. Some say he escaped, some say he was released. But within months of his sandals touching Khmer soil again, he started doing something nobody had ever pulled off in that part of the world before. He started uniting the kingdoms, one by one. Some he conquered with armies, some he charmed with marriages, and some he simply outlasted. The smaller chiefs who'd been fighting each other for generations suddenly found this quiet, patient man showing up at their doorsteps with soldiers behind him and a smile on his face. Most of them folded. By the year 802, Jayavarman II had pulled off something the Khmer people had never seen. He stood on top of a sacred mountain called Mahendraparvata, and in front of his assembled lords, a Brahmin priest performed a ceremony declaring him a god on earth. Not a king, a god king, the living embodiment of the Hindu god Shiva walking around in human form. And just like that, the Khmer Empire was born. This was the trick that changed everything. Before Jayavarman, Khmer chiefs were just chiefs. You could disobey them, fight them, replace them. After Jayavarman, the king wasn't a man anymore. He was a god. Defying him wasn't politics. It was blasphemy. Your soul was on the line. And this idea, the god king, the Divaraja, became the engine that powered the empire for the next 600 years. Every king after Jayavarman would claim the same divine status. Every king would build temples to prove it. And every king would push that empire a little bit further out into the jungle. Sire, the western provinces refused to send tribute again. Then they refused to send tribute to a god. Remind them what that means. They say the harvest was poor. They cannot afford it. The gods do not accept excuses from mortals. And if they still refuse, then the gods will send an army to collect what is owed. The Khmer heartland sat in the middle of what's now Cambodia, on a massive flat plain surrounding a huge lake called the Tonle Sap. And the Tonle Sap was the secret weapon nobody talks about. Every year during the monsoon, the Mekong River would swell so violently that it actually reversed direction and started pouring backward into the Tonle Sap, making the lake balloon to 5 times its dry season size. When the floods receded, they left behind miles of mud so packed with nutrients you could throw rice seeds at it and watch them grow. The Khmer figured out how to weaponize that flood. Other kingdoms in Southeast Asia were stuck with 1 rice harvest per year. The Khmer engineered theirs to produce 3. They dug enormous reservoirs called barrays, some of them so big you could fit entire modern cities inside them, and they used these tanks to store the monsoon water and release it slowly through the dry months. They cut canals across the plain in straight lines so precise that you can still see them from space today. They built dams, sluice gates, and embankments that turned the whole landscape into one giant rice machine. And rice meant people, and people meant soldiers, builders, priests, and farmers, which meant the empire could keep growing. By the year 900, a king named Yasovarman I decided the old capital wasn't grand enough for a god. So he picked a new spot near the northern edge of the Tonal Sap and started building. He named it Yashadharapura, but history would eventually know it by a simpler name, Angkor, just the word for city in Old Khmer, because eventually it would be the only city that mattered. Yasovarman started with a barre that was 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. He built it by hand. No machines, no excavators, just thousands of workers with baskets and shovels moving earth one load at a time. He built a temple mountain in the middle of the city, a giant stepped pyramid representing Mount Meru, the home of the Hindu gods. Every king who came after him would try to outdo him, and for the next 300 years, that's exactly what happened. Each god king arrived, decided the previous temples weren't impressive enough, and built something bigger. The skyline of Angkor kept rising higher and higher into the sky, one temple mountain at a time. "Father, why must we build another temple? The last one isn't even finished, because the gods demand it. The gods, or you. Watch your tongue, boy, the gods speak through me. That is the entire point. And what happens when the people grow tired of carving stone for the gods? Then they will be reminded that without the gods, the rice does not grow." Around 1113, a new king came to the throne. His name was Suryavarman II, and his ambition would make every previous king look modest. Suryavarman II had taken the throne the hard way. He killed his great-uncle in single combat, jumping onto the old king's war elephant mid-battle and finishing him off in front of the army. Subtle was never his style, and when he started planning his royal temple, he didn't want another stepped pyramid in the city. He wanted something the world had never seen before. Something so big, so impossibly grand, that future generations would look at it and assume gods had built it. He picked a flat patch of jungle just south of Angkor's center, and he started construction on a project that would eat up his entire reign and the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers. Angkor Wat. The numbers are still hard to believe. 5 million tons of sandstone, quarried from a mountain 40 kilometers away, then floated down rivers and dragged across the plain by elephants. A central tower rising 65 meters into the sky, taller than a 20-story building. A moat around the whole complex so wide that you couldn't throw a stone across it, 200 meters of water on every side. The carvings alone would take generations. Every wall, every column, every doorframe covered in scenes from Hindu mythology so detailed that scholars are still cataloging them today. Battles with thousands of figures. Dancing celestial women called apsaras, each one slightly different from the next. 2,000 of them in total, all carved by hand into solid stone. "Sire, the quarry masters say we need more workers. The current pace is too slow. How many more?" "Another 20,000, perhaps 30. Take them from the eastern provinces." "The eastern provinces are already short on rice farmers, my lord." "Then take them from the western provinces." "The western provinces sent their men last year and the year before." "Then take them from wherever they are." "The temple must be finished in my lifetime." "And when will that be, my lord?" "When the gods decide, not before." The strange thing about Angkor Wat is that nobody outside the empire knew it existed. There were no foreign visitors writing home about it. No merchants spreading word of the wonder rising in the jungle. Suryavarman built the biggest religious monument on earth in almost complete secrecy, hidden from the wider world by the dense forests of Southeast Asia. But while he was building, he was also fighting. Suryavarman waged war constantly. He pushed the Khmer Empire west into what's now Thailand. He pushed it south into the Malay Peninsula. He even tried to invade Vietnam, marching his armies all the way to the gates of the Vietnamese capital before getting beaten back. His biggest rivalry was with a neighboring kingdom called Champa, which sat along the coast of modern-day central Vietnam. The Khmer and the Khmer had been raiding each other for centuries, but Suryavarman wanted something more permanent. He wanted to wipe them off the map. He never quite managed it, and that failure would come back to haunt his successors in the worst possible way. When Suryavarman died around 1150, his body was carried into Angkor Wat and placed inside the central tower. The temple wasn't just a monument to the gods anymore. It was his tomb. And it was facing west, toward the setting sun, which in Khmer cosmology was the direction of death. The most magnificent building in the world had been built for one man's funeral, but the funeral didn't bring peace. It brought chaos. Within a few years of his death, the empire was tearing itself apart. Civil war broke out between rival branches of the royal family. Provinces stopped sending tribute, and the Khmer, watching from the coast, saw their chance. In 1177, a Khmer fleet did something nobody had ever attempted before. Instead of marching overland through the jungle, they sailed straight up the Mekong River, slipped into the Tonle Sap, and crossed the lake undetected. They landed within sight of Angkor itself. And while the Khmer king was still trying to figure out what was happening, the Khmer warriors poured into the city. How did they get past the river forts? They didn't, my lord. They went around them. That's not possible. The Khmer don't have ships that can cross the lake. They do now. Where is the king? The king is dead, my lord. They killed him in the palace this morning. Then who's in charge? I think for the moment the Khmer are. Angkor was sacked. The greatest city in Southeast Asia, the seat of god kings, the center of the universe in Khmer eyes, was looted by an enemy nobody had taken seriously. The temples were stripped, the palaces burned, and the royal family scattered into the countryside. The empire looked finished, but out in the jungle, a Khmer prince named Jayavarman VII was watching, and he was very, very angry. He'd been living in exile for years, possibly in the Khmer lands themselves, which meant he knew exactly how they fought. He was already in his 50s, an age when most Khmer kings were thinking about their tombs, not their thrones. But Jayavarman VII had something the previous kings hadn't quite figured out. He had patience, and he had a plan. He gathered the scattered remnants of the Khmer army and spent 4 years training them. Not just training them to fight, but training them to fight on water. If the Khmer could attack by river, the Khmer could too. By 1181, Jayavarman VII was ready. He marched on the Khmer forces still occupying parts of the empire, and he didn't just defeat them. He chased them all the way back to their homeland and burned their capital to the ground. When he returned to Angkor, he was crowned king. And then he did something none of his predecessors had ever done. He started building like a man possessed. Not just temples, hospitals, over 100 of them scattered across the empire where any sick person could get treatment regardless of who they were. Rest houses along the roads where travelers could sleep safely on long journeys. A network of stone bridges, some of which are still standing 800 years later. And a brand new capital city built right on top of the old Angkor, surrounded by walls 12 kilometers long. He called it Angkor Thom, meaning Great Angkor. The centerpiece of his new city was a temple called the Bayon, and it was unlike anything that had come before. 216 massive stone faces, each one carved into the side of a tower, all of them staring out at the city below with the same gentle, knowing smile. Some historians think the faces were meant to be Jayavarman himself. Others think they represented a Buddhist deity, because here was the other twist. Jayavarman VII had broken with tradition. He wasn't a Hindu god-king anymore. He was a Buddhist. Sire, the priests are worried. The old gods are being abandoned. The old gods did not save us from the Khmer, but the people have prayed to them for centuries. Then they can pray to Buddha for the next centuries. Jayavarman VII ruled for nearly 40 years, and by the time he died around 1218, the Khmer Empire was at its absolute peak. It stretched from the borders of Burma in the west to the South China Sea in the east, from the Laotian Mountains in the north down into the Malay Peninsula, roughly the size of modern France. And at the center of it all sat Angkor, swollen now to a population that historians estimate at somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million people. To put that in perspective, the largest city in Europe at the same time was Paris, with maybe 200,000. London had perhaps 50,000. Angkor was an absolute monster of a city, the largest pre-industrial urban complex that has ever existed anywhere on Earth. But Jayavarman, the seventh's building spree, had a hidden cost that nobody noticed at the time. He had pushed the empire's labor force to its absolute limit. Every hospital, every rest house, every temple, every wall had been built by farmers pulled away from their rice fields. He had also expanded the irrigation system to its theoretical maximum. There simply wasn't any more land that could be brought under cultivation. The machine was running at full capacity, and there was no room left to grow. And then, slowly, almost invisibly at first, things started to go wrong. In the late 1200s, a Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan arrived at Angkor and stayed for nearly a year. He wrote down everything he saw: the palaces gleaming with gold, the processions of women dancing in the streets, the king riding through the city on an elephant draped in jewels, the endless temples filled with monks. But buried in his report, there are also small details that hint at trouble. The irrigation canals were starting to silt up. Some of the reservoirs weren't being maintained properly. The Hindu temples were being neglected as Buddhism spread among the common people, and the king himself, Zhou noted, rarely left his palace anymore. You came all the way from China to see this. Your emperor wishes to know everything about your kingdom. Then write that the rice grows tall and the king is wise. The rice does grow tall, but your canals are clogged with mud. The canals have always been there. They will always be there. That is what every empire says just before the water stops flowing. The canals were the empire. That was the part nobody fully understood until it was too late. For 500 years, the Khmer had been carving water across the landscape, building bigger and bigger reservoirs, longer and longer channels, more and more intricate networks of dams and sluice gates. The system worked beautifully when it was new, but by the 1300s it was ancient. The barrays were silting up faster than the workers could dredge them. The canals were collapsing in places nobody had time to repair, and the kings, distracted by religious reforms and palace intrigue, weren't paying attention to the boring infrastructure that kept their kingdom alive. Then the weather turned. Tree ring studies done in the past few decades have revealed something the Khmer themselves couldn't have known. In the 1300s and 1400s, Southeast Asia was hit by a series of brutal climate swings. Decades of severe drought, where the monsoon barely came at all, followed by sudden years of catastrophic flooding so violent it tore the irrigation system apart. The Khmer water network had been designed for a stable climate. It couldn't handle chaos. Imagine a city built for snow that suddenly has to deal with hurricanes. That's what happened to Angkor. During the droughts, the rice harvests failed. People started leaving the city, drifting south toward the Mekong Delta, where the land was less dependent on irrigation. During the floods, the embankments burst, the reservoirs overflowed, and entire neighborhoods were swept away. Archaeologists digging in the canal beds have found layers of debris that record these floods in horrifying detail. Bridges torn off their foundations, wooden buildings shattered into splinters. The very engineering that had made Angkor possible was now destroying it. The eastern barray is dry, my lord, completely dry. Then dig it deeper. We have dug it deeper. There is no water to fill it. Then pray for rain. We have prayed for rain for 2 years. And what have the gods said? The gods have said nothing, my lord. The gods have stopped speaking. And while Angkor was crumbling from the inside, a new threat was rising on its borders. A people called the Thai had been moving down from southern China for generations, settling in the valleys west of the Khmer Empire. By the early 1300s, they had built their own kingdoms. The most powerful of them was called Ayutthaya, and Ayutthaya was hungry. The Ayutthayans had been Khmer subjects for centuries. They had served in Khmer armies, paid tribute to Khmer kings, and learned Khmer methods of warfare. Now they used everything they had learned against their former masters. In 1351, they captured a Khmer border city. In 1369, they captured another. Each victory pulled more soldiers, more farmers, more craftsmen out of the Khmer heartland and into Ayutthayan service. The empire was bleeding from 100 small wounds, and there was no king strong enough to stop it. In 1431, after a siege that lasted 7 months, the Ayutthaya army marched into Angkor itself. They didn't burn the city. They didn't have to. They simply looted it, took thousands of captives back to Ayutthaya and left. And here is where the story gets genuinely strange. Because the Khmer king who survived the siege made a decision that historians still argue about today. He didn't try to rebuild. He didn't gather a new army and retake the city. He just left. He packed up his court, his priests, his nobles, his treasures, and he moved the capital hundreds of kilometers south to a small town called Phnom Penh on the banks of the Mekong River. And he never went back. The greatest city on earth was simply abandoned by its own ruler. Why move the capital, my lord? Angkor has been our heart for 600 years. Angkor's heart has stopped beating. We can rebuild. We have always rebuilt. The canals are gone. The reservoirs are gone. The farmers are gone. What exactly would we rebuild? The temples still stand. Temples do not grow rice. Temples do not raise armies. Temples do not hold an empire together. So we abandon them. We do not abandon them. We let the jungle keep them safe until the gods decide what comes next. A few people stayed behind. Monks who refused to leave their temples. Farmers who couldn't afford to move. Old families with too much history in the soil to walk away from it. But within a generation or two, even they were gone. The jungle moved in fast. Trees pushed their roots through the stone walls. Vines wrapped around the towers. Tigers and monkeys took up residence in the abandoned palaces. The canals filled with mud and disappeared. The reservoirs became swamps and then forests. By the time European missionaries first stumbled across the ruins in the 1500s, Angkor had been swallowed so completely that the local Khmer villagers couldn't tell them who had built it. The descendants of the very people who had carved those temples, who had dug those canals, who had ruled half of Southeast Asia for 6 centuries, looked at the stone faces of the Bayon and said gods must have placed them there, or maybe giants. The memory had been erased that thoroughly. A Portuguese friar named Antonio de Madilna visited the site in 1586 and wrote home that the city was so extraordinary it could not be described with a pen. Almost nobody in Europe believed him. They assumed he had wandered too deep into the jungle and lost his mind. It wasn't until 1860 that a French naturalist named Henry Mauhat, who was actually out hunting for insects, pushed through the undergrowth and saw the towers of Angkor Wat rising above the canopy. He wrote that the buildings were grander than anything Greece or Rome had ever left behind. His journals were published after his death from malaria, and suddenly the world remembered. The Khmer Empire wasn't lost anymore, but the empire itself never came back. The Khmer people are still there, of course. Cambodia still exists. The temples have been cleaned up and the tourists arrive by the millions. But the civilization that built all of it, the god kings, the engineers, the army that conquered half of Southeast Asia, that world is gone for good. So what really killed the Khmer Empire? It wasn't a single thing. It was everything at once. A water system too complex to maintain. A climate that suddenly stopped cooperating. A new religion that changed how people thought about kings. A rising rival kingdom on the border. A capital city that had grown too big, too fragile, and too dependent on perfect conditions to keep functioning. Any one of these problems the empire could have survived. All of them together broke its back. The same engineering that made Angkor the largest city on Earth made it impossible to save when things started falling apart. The biggest city in the world drowned in its own ambition. If this kind of story is your thing, you'll probably enjoy the channel. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.